remember standing in that cold lawyer's office, still wearing the black dress for my dad's funeral, trying to process how my entire life had just been reduced to an envelope with $500 inside, while my siblings quietly divided up a $30 million estate like I was never part of this family at all. And the worst part wasn't even the money. It was the way they wouldn't look at me, like I was something embarrassing they needed to get rid of quickly, like I didn't spend years taking care of our dad while they were off living their perfect lives. And when I finally asked if there had been some kind of mistake, my sister just smiled in that cold, calculated way and said, "No mistake, this is exactly what he wanted." And everyone nodded like it was normal, like it made sense that I would get nothing after everything I'd done. So I walked out with that envelope, humiliated and shaking, thinking that was the end of it, until my phone rang later that night and a stranger said something that made my heart stop. "Hi, I'm calling about your father's account. We need to speak with you immediately." I'm 28, married, and until that day, I honestly believed that no matter how complicated my family was, blood still meant something, that at the end of everything, love and loyalty would matter more than money. But I was so wrong, because what happened after my dad died didn't just break my heart, it exposed every ugly truth I had been ignoring for years. The favoritism, the quiet manipulation, the way I was always the one expected to give while everyone else took without question. And standing there in that office, watching my siblings walk away with millions, while I held an envelope that barely covered a week of groceries, something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, irreversible way, like a switch flipping that said I was done being the one they overlooked and underestimated. Because what they didn't know, what none of them even considered, was that my dad and I had a relationship they never understood. One built on late nights, hard conversations, and trust. And that phone call I got later that night proved one thing very clearly. The story they thought was over had only just begun. My dad wasn't always the kind of man people admired, at least not the version my siblings loved to talk about at parties or post about online, because the truth is, for most of my childhood, he was distant, always working, always chasing deals, building what would eventually become that $30 million estate everyone fought over the second he was gone. And while my brother and sister got to live in that polished version of his success, private schools, vacations, everything handed to them, I grew up in the middle of his chaos, watching him build it from nothing, watching the stress, the failures, the nights he didn't come home, and somehow I was the only one who stayed when things started falling apart years later, when his health declined and those same siblings who loved showing off his money suddenly became too busy to even return his calls. I was the one sitting in hospital rooms, the one managing his medications, the one listening to him talk about regrets he never shared with anyone else. And I didn't do it because I expected anything in return. I did it because he was my dad, and despite everything, I loved him. But looking back now, I should have realized something was off, especially in those last few months when he started asking strange questions like whether I trusted banks or if I believed people could really hide things in plain sight. And I remember one night so clearly, he looked at me and said, "Not everything that matters gets written down where people expect it." And I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just another one of his cryptic moods. But now I know he was trying to tell me something important that I completely missed until it was almost too late. And then there was my sister, always perfectly dressed, always performing this role of the concerned daughter whenever anyone else was around. But the second we were alone, she'd roll her eyes and complain about how exhausting it was to pretend, how she couldn't wait for everything to be over so she could finally move on. And my brother wasn't much better, showing up just enough to make it look like he cared, but never staying long enough to actually help, always asking subtle questions about assets, about accounts, about what dad still controlled. And at the time, I ignored it because I didn't want to believe my own family could be that calculated, that cold. But the truth hit me hard the day of the will reading when their grief disappeared the second numbers were mentioned, when lawyers started talking about millions, and suddenly everyone was alert, focused, almost excited. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't shocked by what happened, they were expecting it. Like this had all been planned long before I even walked into that room. Like I was the only one who didn't know the real story. And as I sat there holding that pathetic envelope, watching them exchange subtle looks and satisfied smiles, one question kept repeating in my mind over and over again. What exactly had they done behind my back while I was too busy taking care of our father to notice? That question wouldn't leave me alone, not even after I got home that night and sat on the edge of my bed, still in that same black dress, staring at the envelope like it might suddenly make sense if I looked at it long enough. Because deep down, something felt wrong, not just unfair, but staged, like I had walked into the final scene of something that had been quietly unfolding for months without me. And the more I replayed everything in my head, the more the pieces started shifting into place in a way that made my chest tighten, especially when I thought about how suddenly my siblings had become involved toward the end, how my sister insisted on handling conversations with the lawyer, how my brother conveniently started visiting more often, but always when I wasn't around, and how both of them kept telling me to get some rest or take a break, like they were doing me a favor, when in reality, they were slowly pushing me out of decisions I should have been part of. And I hate to admit it, but I let them because I was exhausted, emotionally drained from watching my dad fade day by day, and I trusted them to at least do the right thing when it mattered most. But that trust started to feel like the biggest mistake of my life the moment my phone rang later that night. And I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something told me I needed to pick up. And when I did, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unexpected. "Hi, is this Emily Carter?" And the second I said yes, my entire body went still as he continued. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm calling from your father's private banking division, and there are a few things we need to clarify with you regarding account authority." And I remember blinking, confused, because that didn't make any sense. My siblings had just taken control of everything, hadn't they? So I asked him what he meant, and there was a pause, like he was choosing his words carefully before saying something that would change everything. "According to our records, you are listed as the primary authorized individual on a separate account your father maintained, and we've been trying to reach you for several days." And I felt my heart start pounding so hard I could barely breathe, because in that moment, two things became painfully clear at the same time. First, my father had never intended to leave me with nothing, and second, whatever this account was, my siblings had no idea it existed. And the way Daniel kept emphasizing urgency, the way he said there were time-sensitive matters that required my immediate attention, told me this wasn't just some forgotten savings account or minor detail. This was something significant, something big enough that they had gone out of their way to track me down directly, bypassing everyone else. And as I sat there gripping my phone, trying to keep my voice steady while my entire reality shifted under me, one thought kept repeating louder and louder in my mind. What if the $500 envelope wasn't the betrayal? What if it was just the distraction, and the real truth was something my siblings never saw coming? I barely slept that night because every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head, repeating those strange things he used to say toward the end, about trust, about things being hidden in plain sight. And by morning, I knew I couldn't ignore that call, so I drove straight to the bank Daniel had mentioned, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they actually hurt, because part of me was terrified this would turn out to be nothing, just some misunderstanding that would leave me right back where I started, but another part of me, a stronger, quieter part, knew this was exactly what my dad had been trying to prepare me for. And when I walked into that building, everything felt different from the moment I stepped inside. The staff already seemed to be expecting me, the way the receptionist looked up, checked her screen, and immediately stood to greet me by name without me saying a word. And within minutes, I was being escorted into a private office where Daniel Reeves was waiting, calm and composed, like none of this was unusual. But the way he looked at me, with a mix of professionalism and something almost like relief, told me I wasn't imagining the importance of this situation. And after a brief introduction, he got straight to the point in a way that made my stomach drop. "Your father set up a private account several years ago under strict confidentiality, and he made it very clear that you were to be the sole person with access. And I remember just staring at him, trying to process what he was saying while my entire understanding of the will reading started to crumble. And then he slid a folder across the table, and what I saw inside made my hands start shaking because this wasn't just an account, it was a fully structured financial portfolio, investments, properties, assets that weren't listed anywhere in the documents my siblings had presented. And the total value wasn't small, it wasn't even close. It was more than half of what they had just walked away with. And suddenly, everything made sense in a way that made me feel both sick and strangely calm at the same time. Because my dad hadn't forgotten me. He had protected me, deliberately, carefully, in a way that made sure no one else could touch what he left behind. And then Daniel said something that shifted the situation from shocking to dangerous. "There's one more thing you should be aware of," and I felt my chest tighten as he explained that in the days leading up to my father's passing, there had been multiple attempts made to inquire about this account, unofficially, by individuals who were not authorized, people who clearly knew something existed but didn't have access to it. And I didn't even need to ask who he meant because I already knew. And in that moment, every look, every whisper, every conveniently timed absence from my siblings came rushing back in a way that made my blood run cold. They hadn't just cut me out, they had tried to find this too and failed. And as I sat there, staring at the proof of everything they didn't get their hands on, one realization settled in deeper than anything else. They thought they had won, that they had no idea the game wasn't over yet. Walking out of that bank, I felt different, not just because of what I had just discovered, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one at a disadvantage. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel the urge to call my siblings or confront them right away, because something told me that reacting emotionally was exactly what they would expect from me, the same way I always had. So instead, I stayed quiet and did something they never thought I was capable of. I paid attention, and over the next few days, things started unfolding exactly the way I needed them to, because it didn't take long for them to realize something was off. The first sign came when my sister called me out of nowhere, her voice overly sweet in a way that immediately raised alarms, asking casual questions about whether anyone had contacted me after the will reading, trying to sound relaxed but clearly fishing for information. And I played my part perfectly, acting confused, even a little hurt, telling her no, that I was still trying to process everything. And I could almost hear the tension in her silence before she quickly changed the subject. But that was just the beginning, because 2 days later, my brother showed up at my apartment unannounced, something he had never done before, suddenly acting concerned, asking if I was doing okay, offering help in a way that felt forced and unnatural. And that's when I knew for sure they were starting to panic, because whatever they had tried to access, whatever they thought they could control, wasn't working. And instead of confronting him, I let him talk, let him underestimate me just like he always had, while quietly confirming everything I needed to know. And then came the moment that shifted everything from quiet suspicion to complete exposure, when Daniel called me again, this time with an update that made my heart race, because apparently those unofficial inquiries hadn't stopped. They had escalated, and now there were legal flags being raised due to repeated unauthorized attempts to gain information about the account, which meant one thing very clearly. My siblings weren't just curious anymore. They were desperate, and desperation makes people careless, and careless people make mistakes. So instead of stopping them, I gave them just enough space to keep going, knowing exactly where it would lead. And it didn't take long, because within another 48 hours, I got the call that changed everything. Not from the bank this time, but from a legal office informing me that a formal investigation had been initiated regarding potential financial misconduct tied to my father's estate. And as I sat there listening, a slow, steady calm settled over me, because everything my siblings had done behind my back, every shortcut, every manipulation, every attempt to control something that was never theirs, was finally catching up to them. And the best part was, I didn't have to do anything dramatic dramatic or destructive to make it happen. All I had to do was step back and let the truth do what it always does, surface at exactly the right time. By the end of that week, everything they thought they had secured started slipping through their fingers faster than they could control, because the investigation didn't just stop at those unauthorized inquiries. It uncovered patterns, decisions, and actions they never expected anyone to question. And suddenly, the same confidence they had at the will reading turned into panic. Calls, messages, even apologies I never responded to, because for once, I wasn't interested in explanations or excuses. I had already seen who they really were when they thought I had nothing, and that was enough for me. And the truth is, I didn't need revenge the way I once thought I did, because watching everything unravel on its own, watching them face consequences they created themselves, was more satisfying than anything I could have planned. And as for me, I walked away with something far more valuable than just money. I walked away with clarity, independence, and the quiet understanding that sometimes karma doesn't need help. It just needs time. So if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or pushed aside like you didn't matter, remember this: the story isn't over just because someone else thinks they've won. And if you believe in stories where karma hits at the perfect moment, make sure you subscribe, because this is just the beginning.